In the early hours of June 13th, 1942, the Atlantic was silent. A thick fog clung to the coast of Long Island, smothering the sound of waves and masking what was about to happen. Out of the darkness, a shape emerged, sleek, black, and glistening with seawater. It was a German U-boat, U-202, sent by the Reich on a mission so secret that even most of its crew didn't know the details. When it surfaced, the hatch opened and four men climbed out, their boots slipping on the wet steel. They were dressed in German naval uniforms, for now. The leader, John Dasch, looked toward the faint outline of the American shoreline. "America," he muttered under his breath. It wasn't admiration. It was disbelief. Each of the men carried a watertight container, packed with explosives, detonators, and wads of American dollars. They were here not as soldiers, but as ghosts to vanish into the fabric of the United States and destroy its war industry from within. The operation had a name, Pastorius, after Franz Daniel Pastorius, the founder of the first German settlement in America, a symbolic choice. But this time, the settlers weren't bringing hope. They were bringing war. At 12:30 a.m., the men slipped into a rubber raft and began to row toward shore. The surf was rough, and the fog was so thick they could barely see the beach. They landed at Amagansett, a quiet fishing village on Long Island. The sand was soft under their boots, American soil. Quickly, they changed into civilian clothes. Their uniforms and gear were buried in the dunes. But before they could move inland, a beam of light cut through the mist. A young Coast Guardsman, John Cullen, on routine patrol had seen them. He walked closer, confused by the figures in the fog. "Who's there?" he called out. Dash's men froze. For a moment, no one moved. Then Dash stepped forward, his mind racing. If they killed the guard, the entire coast would be on alert. If they let him go, the mission might be compromised. Cullen's flashlight stopped on their faces, pale, foreign, nervous. "What are you doing here?" Dash forced a smile. "Fishing," he said. "We got lost in the fog." It was a terrible lie. The guard wasn't convinced, but when Dash slipped a handful of money into his hand, Cullen backed away, his heart pounding. He returned to his station, still unsure what he'd just seen, but his instincts told him to report it. By dawn, the beach was crawling with FBI agents and military police. They found the buried uniforms, the explosives, and clear evidence of a landing. The Nazis had made it to America, but already the clock was ticking. Block 2, the mission. By the time the fog lifted over Long Island, the four men of U-202 were already gone. They had disappeared into America, into the country they were meant to destroy. John Dasch, Ernest Berger, Heinrich Heinck, and Richard Quirin. Four names that meant nothing to anyone that morning. But to the German High Command, they were the sharp edge of a daring operation. Operation Pastorius. Their orders came directly from the Abwehr, the German military intelligence service. The plan was simple in outline but terrifying in scope: to cripple the U.S. war machine before it could fully awaken. Their targets were chosen with surgical precision: aluminum factories in New York and Tennessee, vital to aircraft production, railways and bridges to sever supply routes, locks and canals, especially the Hellgate Bridge and the Horseshoe Curve, crucial arteries for troop and cargo movement, and, if possible, public terror through bombings that would make Americans feel the war had reached their own soil. Each saboteur carried explosives disguised as coal lumps, coal bombs, that could be tossed unnoticed into train tenders or factory furnaces. They had fake identities, forged documents, and thousands of dollars in cash for bribes and travel. Their training, completed months earlier in a secluded sabotage school near Berlin, included chemistry, demolition, and the art of vanishing. 2 weeks later, another U-boat, U-584, landed a second team of 4 on the coast of Florida, in a place called Ponte Vedra Beach. The second team was to link up with Dasch's group in New York. Together, they would operate as invisible cells, 8 men against an entire nation. But already, the plan was crumbling. In New York, Dasch booked a hotel room under a false name. He unpacked the explosives, counted the money, and tried to sleep. But sleep didn't come. Something about the mission gnawed at him. The way it was conceived, the arrogance of it. He'd lived in America before the war. He knew the country, its people. He knew this wasn't a place that would bow to fear. By the third night, Dasch's nerves began to fray. He drank too much, pacing his room, imagining headlines. German agents caught in New York. He pictured electric chairs, the FBI, the shame. He knew the others trusted him, but he didn't trust himself. Meanwhile, the FBI was already piecing the puzzle together. The Coast Guard had found the buried explosives. Every train station, bus terminal, and port was under quiet surveillance. But no one yet knew who the men were, or where they had gone. Dasch, paranoid and desperate, decided on something unthinkable. He would betray the mission. Not out of loyalty to America, but out of fear. He took a train to Washington, D.C., carrying $84,000 in cash, the operation's entire budget, and walked straight into the FBI headquarters. When he asked to see the director, the clerk smiled politely and told him to make an appointment. Then Dasch leaned closer and whispered, "I'm one of the men you're looking for." Within an hour, he was in an interrogation room surrounded by stunned agents. At first, they thought he was insane, but as he began listing details, U-boats, beach landings, explosives, names, the room went silent. By the time Dasch finished, the FBI realized the full scale of what had just happened. A Nazi sabotage network, 8 men trained, funded, and landed on American soil, had been completely exposed by one of its own. The FBI agents didn't believe him at first. A man walks in off the street in the middle of wartime Washington, claiming he's a Nazi spy. It sounded like madness. But John Dasch wasn't crazy. He was calm, too calm. He laid out stacks of money on the table, unrolled blueprints, and named every man who'd come ashore. Then he told them everything. He described the submarine landings, the fake passports, the training in sabotage near Berlin. He explained how they were to operate independently, how their first targets were already chosen. And then, with chilling precision, he gave the FBI the addresses of his fellow agents, hotels, safe houses, train schedules. The Bureau moved fast. Within 48 hours, the entire operation was collapsing. In New York, FBI teams raided the men's rooms before dawn. They found the explosives, the maps, the coded notes. No shots fired, no chase scenes, just quiet arrests and disbelief. By June 27th, all 8 saboteurs were in custody. From the beaches of Amagansett to the cells of Washington, D.C., Operation Pastorius had lasted exactly 2 weeks. J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI director, saw an opportunity. He framed the arrests as a triumph of American counterintelligence, a story of sharp-eyed agents and efficient response. He didn't mention that it was one man's confession that had done it all. To Hoover, Image mattered more than truth. Still, the case shocked the nation. The newspapers called them Hitler's spies in America, plastering their faces across front pages. The public demanded justice, and fast. President Roosevelt personally intervened. He ordered the saboteurs to be tried by military tribunal, not a civilian court. The reason was clear. Espionage in wartime was not just a crime, it was treason, and treason demanded death. In the blazing July heat of 1942, the men were brought into a sealed courtroom in Washington. The curtains were drawn. No photographers, no reporters. Just judges in uniform, prosecutors, and the 8 accused men, heads down, pale, defeated. Dasch sat apart. He was both the betrayer and the betrayed, hated by his comrades, distrusted by his captors. He thought his cooperation would save his life. He was half right. After weeks of testimony, the verdict came swift and brutal. 6 of the 8 were sentenced to death, including men who had never planted a single bomb. Dasch and Berger, who had cooperated with U.S. authorities, received prison sentences instead of execution. On August 8, 1942, at 1 a.m., the electric chair in the District of Columbia prison was switched on. 6 men died that night, silently, one after another. Their bodies were buried in unmarked graves. The press never saw the executions. The government wanted them forgotten as quickly as possible. Dasch spent the war years in prison, writing letters to Washington, begging for recognition, claiming he'd saved America from within. No one listened. He was eventually deported back to Germany in 1948, branded both a traitor and a fool. In America, he was a spy. In Germany, a betrayer. He died alone in 1992, convinced that history had misunderstood him. When the headlines hit, America exhaled, but only for a moment. Across the nation, the story spread like wildfire. Nazi spies caught on U.S. soil. People read it in disbelief. War had felt distant, something happening across oceans. Now it had arrived, quiet and unseen, in the dunes of Long Island and the shores of Florida. The newspapers praised the FBI. The president called it proof that no enemy can strike within our borders unpunished. But buried beneath the triumph was a deeper unease, a sense that the line between justice and fear had blurred. The 6 executed men became ghosts of a story no one wanted to tell. Their names erased, their graves unmarked. Even the U-boats that carried them were sunk months later in the Atlantic, swallowed by the same ocean that had delivered them. In the halls of Washington, their case became a quiet precedent, a reason for expanded surveillance, for secret tribunals, for power that needed no sunlight. Operation Pastorius was over, but its shadow lingered, shaping the invisible wars to come. Dasch, sitting in a small apartment in post-war Germany, wrote his memoirs by candlelight. He titled them 8 Spies Against America. In it, he described not the mission, but the loneliness that followed, how he had tried to warn both sides, how he had thought his confession would make him a hero. But to the world, he remained something worse than a spy. He was a man who belonged nowhere. In 1948, he wrote one final letter to the U.S. government. "I did not come to destroy, but to prevent destruction. I thought that would mean something. It didn't." The letter was never answered. Dasch died decades later, in silence. His story remembered only in declassified archives and yellowed newspaper clippings. But Operation Pastorius was more than a failed Nazi plot. It was the first time America had to confront a truth it still struggles with. that the greatest threats often come not from armies, but from within, from fear, secrecy, and the decisions made in dark rooms when no one is watching. They look straight into the camera. 8 men, 8 pairs of eyes, some defiant, some empty, some already aware that their story has ended. George Dasch, the man who betrayed them, sits apart in another photo. His stare distant, uncertain, caught between guilt and justification. The others, Quirin, Neubauer, Heinck, Thiel, Haupt, Curling, Berger, all captured within days, all trapped in a story too big for them to control. Each one believed he was serving his country. Each one believed the mission would make him a hero. Instead, they became the faces of failure and fear. When the FBI released these mugshots to the press, America studied them like curiosities from another world. They weren't monsters. They were ordinary men, bakers, machinists, ex-sailors, who had crossed an ocean to wage an invisible war and found only electric walls waiting for them. Their names would soon fade, replaced by headlines, then silence. But their story marked the beginning of something new. The modern age of espionage, surveillance, and quiet wars fought far from the front lines. In Berlin, the Abwehr pretended nothing had happened. The officers who planned the operation buried it under paperwork and excuses. To admit failure was unthinkable. To admit betrayal, impossible. Years later, historians would call Operation Pastorius a farce, a doomed mission led by amateurs. But to the men who lived it, it was deadly serious. A collision of loyalty, fear, and the slow realization that no one escapes history's verdict. The 8 men landed in America as soldiers of the Reich. They died, or vanished, as shadows in another nation's story. For a few weeks, they carried the weight of an empire's ambition on their shoulders. Then, in a courtroom and a flicker of current, it was gone. Dasch once said, "If I had done nothing, people would have died. Because I spoke, I died differently." He never received thanks. His old comrades called him a traitor. His new country called him a spy. And history mostly forgot him. But every intelligence agency that followed, CIA, KGB, MI6, learned something from that failed mission, that the real war doesn't always end with bombs or invasions. It ends in hotel rooms, whispered phone calls, and a single man deciding whether to stay silent or speak. The courtroom was quiet when the verdict was read. No one cheered. No one moved. The 8 men, the saboteurs of Operation Pastorius, stood in the dim light of the military tribunal, eyes hollow from sleepless weeks. The sound of papers rustling echoed louder than the words that sealed their fate. 6 were sentenced to death. 2, George Dasch and Ernst Berger, to prison. But for Dasch, prison was just another kind of exile. He had betrayed the mission, yes, but he had also saved hundreds of lives. In the end, both sides saw him as the enemy. When the executions were carried out in August 1942, there were no public spectators, just guards, a priest, and the hum of the electric chair. The government kept it quiet. The U.S. didn't want panic, and Berlin didn't want shame. The bodies were buried in unmarked graves at Blue Plains, far from the headlines they once filled. Back in Germany, Admiral Canaris, head of the Abwehr, received the news with silence. He didn't punish anyone. He didn't ask for explanations. He simply wrote in his diary, "Failure teaches more than success ever will." But the ripples of that failure traveled far. The FBI, shocked by how close the saboteurs had come, built an entire division around domestic intelligence. the roots of what would later become the modern counter-espionage network. For America, Pastorius became a cautionary tale. For Germany, it became a quiet embarrassment, whispered only in archives. And yet, the story didn't truly end there. Years later, after the war, Dasch walked out of prison, a free man with nowhere to go. He returned to Germany, but it wasn't home anymore. The people there saw a traitor. The Americans saw a spy. He lived alone in a small apartment, surrounded by newspaper clippings and memories. He once wrote in a letter that no one ever published, "I fought for both sides, and both sides lost me." He died in 1992, unnoticed, uncelebrated, forgotten. But the echoes of his choice never disappeared. Because in that single act of betrayal, he'd exposed something that intelligence agencies would chase for decades: the fragility of loyalty. When the Cold War began, the ghosts of Pastorius returned in another form: sleeper agents, covert drops, coded broadcasts across the Atlantic. The war for secrets never stopped. Only the uniforms changed. Somewhere in a dusty archive in Washington, there's still a box labeled Operation Pastorius, declassified. Inside are faded photos, typed confessions, and a small note written in pencil: "The human mind is the most dangerous weapon." It's a fitting epitaph for the men who crossed the ocean believing they were fighting a war, only to discover that the real battle was within themselves. George John Dasch, FBI file number 65-1065, captured, interrogated, and recorded in the archives as informant. But to the men who trained beside him in sabotage school near Berlin, he was something far worse: a traitor. He wasn't supposed to end up here, staring into a camera in New York City with a prisoner tag around his neck. He was supposed to be in the shadows, detonating factories, derailing trains, spreading fear through a country at war. Instead, he picked up a phone and called the FBI. No one knows exactly why. Some say he panicked. Some say he wanted fame or money or safety. But when agents listened to the trembling voice on the other end of the line, they heard something else: exhaustion. A man who had crossed an ocean, wearing loyalty like a disguise, and found himself unable to carry the weight of it. In just 48 hours, he told them everything: names, codes, drop points, ciphers. He even handed over the money, $84,000 in cash, meant to fund the sabotage campaign. For the FBI, it was the break of the century. For Germany, it was an invisible disaster. The mission was over before it had begun. When the executions came, Dasch wasn't among them. He sat alone in a guarded room, listening to the low hum of the city that had nearly become his battlefield. The government promised him protection, maybe even a new life. But promises made in the dark rarely survive daylight. After the war, they sent him back to Germany, not as a hero, not even as a free man, but as a problem solved. He lived quietly, changing apartments, working odd jobs, writing letters to officials who never replied. He tried to publish his story once: 8 Spies Against America. It sold almost nothing. The world had already moved on. The Cold War had begun. The new spies didn't use submarines or sand-covered crates. They used telephones, microphones, and secrets hidden in plain sight. Dasch had become a ghost, the man who ended a war before it started. But in the corridors of intelligence, his name never really disappeared. Every officer who studied espionage in the decades that followed learned his case. They studied his motives, his mistakes, his decision. Because George Dasch didn't just betray a mission, he changed the rules. In a war built on loyalty, he showed that conscience could be deadlier than any bomb.